Playing a sonata is a form, not only a contents. And factually, composers like Beethoven started breaking and disorganizing the beautifully organized order of Haydn about pure music that describes only itself in 4 movements with 2 themes and a aria ABA lead form and then a minuet with a middle section trio as well as a rondo finale. While it expresses, of course, human nature, experience of elevation of spirit, of in fact humanity, it is not a poem or a fantasy or a pure translation of an intensity that corresponds to a human experience. It's really how you write music, that it's no more the imitation of dance like in the suites or art form of songs where you can express without words lyrical aspects. Of course, you have the polyphony of the fugue. And then inside the sonata, which of course means sounds, resonances, compared to the cantata, which is song, voice, canta. It's instrumental, but evocative through the instrumental performance of course, arias and other instruments, but not per se for the psychological intent of what the music can be used for or is necessity for things like a funeral march, for instance, and the idea of walking, pacing behind a coffin of a beloved who is dead, and this processional element of the funeral march in Beethoven's 3rd or 7th symphony or in Chopin's 2nd sonata is a way to get, in fact, out of the pure music form and get closer to the program music. When I teach a sonata, I want to teach a student to play architecturally. Of course, they don't reconstruct the piece, it's already built by the composer, but they have to present it with the proportions and the tempi with their meanings. For instance, in the 2nd sonata by Chopin, the first introduction is drastic. It's more like attracting attention if the members of the salon were still talking while he started playing. And then the agitated first theme presented on the downbeat Eastern European or on the upbeat version, récit do récit or récit do récit, brings you to this agitato, which is so intense. But in fact, because it's so intense, it's in fact very short in proportions. And then you enter in the relative major, D-flat major with a chorale, 2nd theme, la, fa, sol, fa, mi, fa, fa, re, la, sol, fa, mi, la, si, do, re, mi, fa, si, do, re, mi, fa. So what do you think then? In proportions, you want to stay there. It sounds like the heart of the movement, even if the essence of the movement is the first theme, the agitato. Of course, they combine in the development, and in the recapitulation, you obtain this beautiful return of the 2nd theme in the principal key, but in major, as it was when it was in the relative major. And so you have in proportion, even if you don't take the repeat in the exposition, which some people avoid, besides there is a controversy where to take it from because there is no first, second ending. But one way or the other, modal or tonal, you return to B-flat minor. But even if you don't play it, then you have still in whole construction, in proportions, more of a slow section, which is the 2nd theme, than the agitated first theme, even with the recap. Then comes the second movement, the Scherzo. And that Scherzo is driven, chromatic, lively, feisty. Si, mi, fa, mi, fa, sol, la, si, double bémol. And you feel like, oh my God, so much energy in such a short time. But while you play it as a performer, it might appear to you like hours long, because so much is input in so little time. And then comes the incredible G-flat major middle section of the Scherzo. Si, fa, sol, mi, re, sol, la, si. Re, la, si, sol, fa, si, do, re. Another slow movement. Like the second theme proportional in the first. It takes 2/3 of the Scherzo, because the return to the Scherzo prime is very short too. But intense, so it doesn't appear so. And then comes the next movement, the funeral march, where then Chopin breaks the rule of the sonata as a form, pure music, not program music, and he adds a funeral march with a title for it. Slow, processional, with the quarter notes in the left hand, and the middle section is in, again, like first movement, in the relative major, solar, shining D-flat major. Fa, sol, fa, mi, re, do, si, la. Sol, la, sol, fa, mi, re, la. And it doesn't say if it's in the same tempo, because, in fact, the tradition of how slow the procession would be as an imitation, this time no more pure music, but really program music, of the A section of the procession, could, if it's too slow, have the B section a bit faster to sing, and you don't have dotted rhythms like in the austere first section. Si, 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 re, do, do, si, 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 si. Everybody knows that piece. It's used with marching harmony soldiers for many funerals in public, in state funerals. It became the funeral march, part of a piano sonata, but with a structurally very long B section. After the long B section in the Scherzo, and after the long second theme exposition and recap in the first movement. So in fact, in 3 consecutive movements, you have intense but brief in time agitato energizing elements thematically. And then you have a D-flat major second theme, la, fa, sol, fa, mi. Second movement, you have si, fa, sol, mi, re, sol, la, si. And then fa, sol, fa, mi, re, do, si, la, for the middle section of the funeral march. Those could have been separate nocturnes. He wrote so many. Fa, mi, re, fa, la, in the same D flat, re, fa, si, la, mi, fa, do, re, la. And the B section of the funeral march is in D flat major and sounds the same, not same, of the same vein, same cloth. Fa, sol, fa, mi, re, do, si, la. The B sections usually are there to contrast with the A section, so inevitably if it's tragic it has to be soothing, but not always, and depends how much. In Beethoven, he doesn't always do that. Sometimes the trios are just, or in Schubert Last Sonata also, they're just side music to not add more intensity to a very intense thematic material in the first theme. Well, it depends how people consider the importance of the two themes in the structural and in its weight on the gravitas of the piece. After all, it's a question of scope, not only length. But inevitably, the slower sections in tempo last longer than the driven short ones that are fast. And so you as a performer didn't choose the sonata of Chopin the way he composed it, organized the order of the movements and their proportions in terms of the lengths. So you bring it to life from the score. Notation is not all, well, it is most. But no, it becomes alive through you. So if you think of that, as I like to make the students think, is play fully what it means to you, because you only want to study what you love already. I cannot make them love the sonata. I can make them think about it, organize it, in a way, as a conductor, oversee the whole structure between the first note of the first movement and the last note of the fourth movement, which is a perpetual motion in one single flow. It's really not even a movement in length. It's really a conclusion to the, well, it can be called separate movement anyway, to the funeral march. But in other words, what is interesting is to combine the intensity of the emotion that the music creates through the different inspirational thematic materials in the sonata, but also think in proportions. And perhaps then your second theme in the first movement will be not that slow, because you think that the middle section of your scherzo that follows will be not that slow, a little slower, but that the slowest of the three should be the B section of the funeral march in order to keep the tempo with the march itself. Does all that mean anything to any performer? Because you could say, but that takes away all the intuition, all the connection of inspirational matters between the audience and the pianist with the piano alive. And it becomes too much analytical considerations, like a general organizing the battlefield, but not being on it or in it. It was true, the composer doesn't leave the interpretation as legacy, but the notes, the pitches, the rhythms, the elements that put together brings the music alive, and therefore all what it carries in itself, regardless if it's called our funeral march or you think of it as a funeral march, because after all, a lot of the hint is in the music itself, which only expresses what it is itself. It's not only a translation of feelings. And in a way, you can say that there are ways to organize the proportions, not because you think that Chopin didn't organize them right in the order, but you want to bring a sense of completion of how you project yourself through the movements. And this sonata, therefore, yes, it is a form, even if loosely broken with parts of program music rather than absolute music or pure music, which a form by itself describes. And of course, after Haydn, Beethoven's 4-movement sonatas became 3, then 2. In other words, then in the early modernism with Berg and Scriabin, post-romantic as they were, or Mettner, you have the 1-movement sonatas. So anything can be called sonata, no more because of the form that Haydn in the first Viennese school left us as a legacy. I think that it is meaningful to know, because when Schubert writes the C-sharp minor funeral march in 1827, precisely for having been part of the procession of Beethoven's burial, and he dies 10 months later or so. And in his last sonatas in the summer of 1828, the last one in B-flat major, he introduces the slow movement, which in fact he wrote in C-sharp minor, and he didn't transpose it in a conveniently relative minor G minor that could have been when he inserts it into this last sonata for piano, but he keeps it in C-sharp minor. He doesn't call it funeral march, but we know he did write it in that intention as an inner homage. He wasn't performed or anything. As a teacher, I feel like it's important to give the student the vision, the structure, as well as the emotion, the intensity. Then the fingerings, the phrasing, the pedaling, the articulation, the style, the sense of rubato, how much too much, and give them a sense of good taste, which might be not shared, but it's yours. And you tell them, this is how I arrived to understand the piece at the point of my life after companionship with it for the last 45 years. You're just in your first encounter with the piece. Imagine how you'll think about it after you taught it, recorded it, performed it, or possibly wrote an article about it or a book. But ultimately, it's an encounter between an intensity on score and what you bring alive from it. You can imitate performers, you can follow orders of a teacher, and perhaps their own students will ask them, am I supposed to play the middle section of the funeral march faster or in the same tempo? You can give them answers about organizing their thoughts, about organizing their tastes, about planning ahead the structure of the whole piece, not just section by section, movement by movement, just put together. To have a strategic view as well as an intense emotional, every time when played, going through with a sense of marveled discovery. It's not faked, in fact. It is truly so. You let yourself possessed by the storytelling of the piece. It's powerful evocation storytelling. Who knows how much of all these ideas remain with the student? Doesn't have to be all, might be none. But you feel, because of this respect for the student, that you give them the experience of your life so far, even if it might be that you always thought of it wrong, but in the eyes of the beholder, right. It's easy to say they don't know what they're doing, it's not supposed to be like that. Fine, that's true. We have authenticity, progressed a lot in authenticity with the additions and the musicologists. But it doesn't matter. Ultimately, at some point, ignorant or over-informed, you design that ephemeral construction that vanishes as soon as finished being played. And the journey is the trip's aim, certainly. That's the faster option of the second theme in the first movement because of the agitated. Becoming. But you could then, in contrast, spread. By itself is totally justifiable and beautiful, meaningful, inspired, natural, not organized or precious, not making a point, just following the flow of the events. When you return to the recap or to the exposition, the first reprise, and then this takes so much in the first movement, as I said, in terms of space. It lies as a central structure of the construction. Then in the Scherzo, the Scherzo is not a joke, as this etymology says. It's dramatic. It's the comedy of life. It's a scream that is chromatically rising with the repeated notes in the ostinato of the right hand, and all this is so intense and so brief. And immediately you have a middle section. Again the aria, this time in G flat major, restaken in B flat minor. It doesn't have to be played as loud as I did. Sometimes teaching drives me so hyper that I end up by playing louder than I should. It should be something like abandoned and let flow. And then when you have the following movement being the funeral march, In the middle section. Of course, there are broken arpeggios in the left hand. Harmonization is easy pedaling, especially spread SATB disposition. And the melody is totally semitones and tones. It calls more for finger legato overlapping just a little after it's welcome. To defeat the decay, but not go, well, we all are in denial as pianists, and we can sing with a percussive instrument, but nevertheless, if it is less slow, well, that was not in Chopin. What it brings us to understand is that the pacing is also the structuring of the phrase according to the decay of the long values. Of course, acoustics instruments change too, the whole paradigm, but generally, if you play the leading tone of, well, let's start from the beginning of it. It's difficult to be convincing of a funeral paced procession at a certain level of tempo, of fast tempo. Or in the middle of it. Maintaining the unexpected accents from popping up and taking away from this morning atmosphere brings some pianists to play slow because they control more the dynamics of the piano and the repeated notes and the idea of the soundscape. But there is a margin with which you can still play a bit faster, but without to be agitated in this section. And that brings you almost to be in the tempo of the middle section. So, first movement, second movement, third movement, this lyrical, evocative of reflection and at the same time some sense of nostalgia or hope, at least solace, are way in structure taking more space in the construction than the first movement's agitato first theme or agitato scherzo first section. And so, of course, taken by excerpts like that, it seems obvious that it's contrasting. But when it takes its time and it settles, you follow it, you construct it, you have room to work with subtle tempo rapports between the sections. Regardless, in this case, I suggest between movements, so that you play the second theme very flowing forward, the B section of the Scherzo, eloquent, a bit well disposed but not overstretching, and then I think the B section of the Funeral March is the one that should take the most of its existence spread through the structure. I believe that, as I said earlier, a sonata is a construction. It's essential music, though it can have this, in this case, some character music that corresponds to a specific usage of music as a funeral procession, for instance, which is partly not to be in a sonata, because a sonata by itself should not have program music in itself, but it does. And Beethoven with the Tempest, or the Leberwohl, the departure, that was the missing, the departure was. And then the missing, the absence. And the joy of the return. Of course, he didn't call the moonlight, moonlight. But with the theme and variations in 109, in the fugue of 101, or even in the, it's not real fugue, but you have an element of fugal exposition in 110. I mean, why not? And that's what's beautiful to observe, that we have this incredible wealth of existence of old music that we have access to, way more than our predecessors had for their music of their own past. So it gives us a perspective of the evolution of the form, which is just mesmerizingly exciting to share and teach. So you can play, yes, mostly with your love for the piece, your instinctive musicianship, your ear hearing, your ear, and then also your knowledge about what you're playing. In what is it enshrined, this piece? And the living vector of the dead scroll, so to say, of the music, the written music, is what you do with it when you play it.